Okay, kinesiology 230. This is chapter 19. We are moving on here. This is presentation number 5. We're talking hyperlipidemia. Got some big words on this one, let me tell you. So with hyperlipidemia, it's a general term that's used for describing elevated concentrations of any or all of the lipids, meaning fats, in the blood. These can be cholesterol, these can be triglycerides, lipoproteins. And hyperlipidemia usually indicates a couple different things here. And within the lipoprotein subcategory, we have high density lipoproteins and low density lipoproteins. That's HDL. Let me get over here. HDL and LDL. Dyslipidemia is a condition that's an abnormal lipid level in the blood. So these are associated with atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Say that one fast quickly, huh? Which is basically a hardening of the arteries, and that can lead to heart attack or stroke. And it makes sense in terms of every time the heart contracts, squish, it's exerting force because of the blood being forced into the vascular system. It applies force into the walls of the arteries at the very and the aorta and the arteries as it leaves the heart. And what ends up happening is you need to have some elasticity in the vascular system to accommodate that blood pressure gradient that happens from when the heart is squishing blood to when it's relaxing, which, as you know, is systolic over diastolic. And LDL, that is low density lipoprotein, and low density lipoprotein contributes to the fatty buildup and the narrowing of arteries. So you can think of this in terms of a couple things that are going on here, one of which is you have a vascular system that's becoming more rigid, and the pressure itself that's being exerted is not really being dissipated through the system because it's losing its elasticity through the atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And then you also have a narrowing of the arteries, which is atherosclerosis. So notice with these, the verbiage is darn close when you start off with the root word athero, but it ends up being a little bit different when we start talking about the atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease versus sclerosis in general, because the cardiovascular disease itself is a hardening of the arteries, which could lead to a heart attack and stroke, which is the cardiovascular component. And just the atherosclerosis itself is a narrowing of the arteries. So you have kind of a twofold thing going on here, one of which is the fatty buildup on the walls, narrowing the arterial walls, and then the other is a hardening of the arteries, which really is a double whammy in terms of wellness. So total cholesterol. With total cholesterol, let me get on over here. Lower is better is the way to go, but optimal is about 150 milligrams per deciliter, with LDL below 100 milligrams per deciliter. And then they also emphasize HDL, which is high density lipoprotein, which is the good cholesterol. And that's the cholesterol that doesn't stick, if you will, and doesn't cause a clogging or narrowing of the arteries. Now, with this, HDL is a little bit different because you'd like for it to be higher. So it's going to be above 40 milligrams per deciliter. Anything below that becomes a contraindication. Now, if we look at this chart over here, we have the lipid itself, which is high LDL levels, Then we have low HDL levels. Remember, higher is better for this one, lower is better for this one. And then triglycerides. And they talk about the possible causes here, and then they talk about the possible treatment strategies. I would just say take a moment and kind of wrap yourself around some of these. And we've said it before in this class, one of the best drugs for many of the things that you see in terms of hypokinetic illnesses is, quite frankly, just get up and start moving. You know, many of the things that you see here, whether it's type 2 diabetes, elevated triglycerides, maybe it's overweight or obesity, these are things that can be resolved through movement. With dietary fat modification, and believe me, I'm not a nutritionist, I don't have a license to do nutrition, but there's a couple things that really come into having fat modification in a diet. And you can talk about healthy intake of good fats. You'd like to have foods that are rich in mono unsaturated and poly unsaturated fats from olive oil, canola oil, nuts, seeds, avocados, olives, flaxseed, soy, fatty fish such as salmon. And you'll have some sub-arguments on which ones are better than others, but the book just lists these kind of broadly. Omega-3 is, for example, one type of polyunsaturated fat that has an additional protective benefit against cardiovascular disease, including lowering triglycerides, so it has kind of a double whammy. And then they go further into saying that you want to minimize saturated and trans fats, and then you want to limit sugar from beverages. All right. When we get into the beverages themselves, they talk about the amount of sugar per se. And so nutritionally speaking, when you get your sugar from a soda or other drinks, it ends up being a sugar-rich or glycogen-rich drink. And there's some arguments in terms of, is it better to drink a sugar or a diet, like a regular or a diet soda? And there's some arguments that go both ways. But in general, what the book is stating here is you're trying to focus on types, or you're not trying to focus on types of sugar, you're just trying to focus on all added sugars. And for men, you want to limit the amount that people have in their diet. And they note that for women, it's 100 kilocalories per day. For men, it's 150 kilocalories per day. And from that, you can start to kind of do the math in terms of, okay, how many added sugars do I actually have from drinking a couple sodas a day or having a Gatorade, etc. And it starts to add up. And the goal is just to limit those sugars. Now, with exercise prescription, I don't like the idea of prescription here, but the book used it, and they used it in a previous chapter, so I'm going to go for it. When you look at cardiovascular fitness, it falls in line with many of the previously mentioned exercise recommendations. They talk about at least 150 minutes. You want 30 minutes 5 days a week, at least 75 minutes of vigorous. So 25 minutes 3 days a week, combination therein, or at least 2 days of moderate to high intensity muscle strength exercise, which is great. We've seen this before. We know this before. It's pretty straightforward stuff. So with that, guys, I'm going to break out and go to the next presentation. I'll be right back.